Hi, my name is Bente, I'm the Norse Witch, and welcome to a new series on my channel. In this series I will talk about the different methods that you can use to time your spells, your rituals, your offerings, etc. Basically any magical or spiritual activities. Make sure to tell me in the comments which topics you want me to cover. I already have a lot of topics planned, like this first topic, which is the moon phases, but also things like the days of the week or the zodiac signs, the seasons, times of the day. If you have a topic that you want me to specifically cover, then tell me about them in the comments and I will include it in my new series. But as I already said, in this first video we will start out with a very basic beginner topic, and that is the moon phases, which a lot of you will probably already have heard of, but of course there are always new witches and new magical practitioners out there who don't. So let us cover this topic first. In my opinion, this is a very basic, very beginner-friendly topic because it's one, very easy to understand, and two, it's even easier to apply. So let's get into it. Working with the moon has been an integral part of human life for a long time in history. For example, calendars previously used to work with the moon cycles instead of with the sun, and agriculture also heavily relied on the moon cycle. So of course, this bled into magical workings also. We see the moon phases being used in very modern practices as well as in older folk traditions. For example, I am getting into Scandinavian folk magic at the moment, and in Scandinavian folk magic, the moon phases are still used for the workings. Overall, in my experience, but also in a lot of other people's experience, working with the moon phases to time spells and rituals and any magical workings is just very effective and very easy to do. That is why it's usually seen as such a beginner topic, and it's usually one of the first topics that is covered in beginner witchcraft books. But how do you do that? Before we get into how to apply the moon phases for your magical workings, maybe we should look at how they come to be. Like, why does the moon look different every single day? How do these phases come to be? How long are they? Etc. So as you probably know, the moon moves around the Earth and the Earth moves around the Sun. So we have a constellation where there are three planetary bodies that are moving around each other. So we have the moon circling around the Earth and the Earth at the same time moving around the Sun. So we have some kind of weird movements going on. So that of course also means that the way in which the moon, the sun and the earth are situated to each other are always different. So for example, the sun can be here, the earth is here, and the moon is right here. But it's also possible that the sun is right here, the moon here, and the earth here, or the sun is here, the earth is here, and the moon is somewhere here. It is always moving and always changing, and what we see as the moon at night, we only see it because the moon or the moon's surface reflects the sunlight. So for example, if we have a full moon, what we actually see is the whole surface of the moon reflecting the sunlight back to us. So that comes to be when we have the sun, then we have the earth, and then we have the moon. So of course, if the sun is right here and the earth is here, then of course we have this side of the earth would be illuminated, it's daylight, and the other half is in the shadow, so there is nighttime. But with the moon, of course, we have this side, of course, illuminated, the side that is towards the sun. What the people on the earth where it's nighttime sees is the whole side of the moon reflecting the sunlight back. So that is why the moon looks circular to us. It's a full moon. It is fully illuminated by the sunlight. Whereas, for example, if we have a dark moon, so we don't see a moon at all, that would be when we have the sun, then the moon, and then the earth. So of course, since the sun illuminates the moon and the earth is behind the moon, we only see the shadow. The moon doesn't reflect any sunlight back to us, so we can't see it. So we have a dark moon. And since it's then moving around, at some point it will be down here. So we have the sun, the earth, and the moon. And the moon will be illuminated by the sun from one side. So what we see from the earth is a half moon. So that is basically why the moon looks different depending on the day, why we have half moons and new moons and full moons, etc. And we see it's basically just the sunlight being reflected back to the earth, and that will be important later. And then this whole cycle lasts for 29.5 days. So the moon needs 29.5, approximately 29.5 days to go from a full moon to a full moon again. So that means we also have a full moon every 29.5 days. We have a dark moon every 29.5 days. So that also means if we want to, for example, work with specifically a full moon or specifically the dark moon or the new moon, we can do that every 29.5 days, which is pretty convenient because that is once a month. So that is pretty easy to work off of. So now let us get into a little bit of terminology. I already said we have full moons and dark moons and half moons. But what happens when the new moon goes around the earth and it's getting illuminated more and more and more by the sun, so we see more and more and more and more of the moon every single day. The phase in which the moon is, for us, seemingly getting bigger because we see more and more and more of it every single night, that would be the waxing phase. While after the full moon, it's getting smaller and smaller and smaller again, or we are seeing less and less and less of it. That means it's a waning moon. So in general, we have a dark moon. And by the way, I will differentiate between a dark and a new moon here. Some people see it as the same thing. I don't really. So just so you're aware of it. So we have a dark moon. You don't see the moon at all. It grows and grows and grows. That is where it's waxing. Then we have a full moon. Then it's getting smaller and smaller and smaller again. So it's waning. And what I personally see as the new moon is the very, very, very first moment when you start seeing the moon again. So you have basically the dark moon, you don't see the moon at all. And then at some point you see a tiny little moon sickle, and that is the new moon. For me personally, I see it that way. Not everyone works with it that way. That is how I personally see it, because it makes more sense to me. And some people also divide it in even more phases. So for example, if you have a waxing moon, but you only see a crescent moon, so a little sickle, they would call it a waxing crescent. Then you would have a waxing half, where you see exactly half the moon. And then when it's still waxing, but it's kind of like a half moon with a little belly, they would call it a waxing gibbous. Gibbous, I have no clue how to pronounce it. They would call it that. And then of course you would have also a waning gibbous, a waning half, and a waning crescent. I don't personally work with that, so I will keep it simple for now. I will just go into dark moon, new moon, waxing, full moon, and waning. The general idea of working with the moon for spell timing, at least that is how I see it, some people see it differently, that is just how I see it, is that the bigger the moon gets, or the more you see of the moon, of course the more sunlight gets reflected back to the earth. That is why we see more of the moon, and that means there is more energy that can be worked off of. So if you have a dark moon, not that much energy there, but the bigger it gets, the more energy is there to work off of. And then you have a full moon, and that is like the whole shebang, basically, the maximum of energy that you can work off of, when you're working with the moon at least. And you can look at it basically as a metaphor. I like to look at it as a metaphor for a flower, for example. You start the whole thing with a new moon, so the little tiny little sickle. It's basically the first step in this life of the flower. So you have a tiny little sprout that's kind of trying to peek through the soil. That is the new moon. Then it is waxing, so it's getting bigger, the plant is growing, you see more and more of the beautiful foliage of the plant, until you have a full moon, where this flower is in full growth, it is fully blossoming and blooming, it's smelling great, it has reached its full potential and its full bloom, basically. After that though, the energy is declining. It's kind of falling apart. The flower has reached its full potential, it has served its purpose, and now it's time to retract again. So the flower is slowly dying off while the moon is getting smaller and smaller and smaller until we have a dark moon where there is no energy left. The plant has died off and it's now hibernating and waiting until the new spring, which would be the first crescent of the new moon again, to start growing again. So how can we now work off of these phases for our magical practice? When we have this first tiny little crescent, the new moon, it's a new beginning, the plant is sprouting, everything is fresh and new, so it's of course time for new projects, new beginnings, maybe new relationships with new spirits. Anything where you're starting something new, or you're maybe planning for the future, planning for this moon phase. There are, for example, a lot of practitioners that like to use the time of the new moon to plan ahead for 29.5 days, everything that they want to do during this moon cycle, and they would start it anew every single moon cycle. The new moon is also great to start larger workings where you need more time. So for example, if you want to use the full time of the waxing moon to basically cast this huge attraction spell maybe for the whole, maybe even the whole moon cycle, then you would start this usually at a new moon because it's the first step. What I also really like to do is some divination. So for example, if you want to know what will happen during this moon cycle, this new moon cycle, you could do some divination for that purpose on a new moon. Then next up we have the waxing moon, so the time where the moon is getting bigger and bigger and bigger every night. There is more and more and more energy available. You can see that as a metaphor for anything that should grow, that should get bigger, that should come to you basically. So the waxing moon is usually a great time to do anything like attracting, anything that would want to grow. So for example, you can do some money magic, you can do anything with prosperity, love workings, anything where you have to kind of pull something towards you or where you want to get something to grow. Then next up we have the full moon, where of course you have the full potential, the full maximum energy available. So that is a great time for anything that needs a lot of energy. Like if you're planning any huge workings, do them on a full moon because there's like the maximum amount of energy available. So yeah, I personally prefer doing huge workings on full moons, anything where I need a whole lot of energy. I basically try to time spells that I want to do around full moons simply because there is so much energy available. But if I want to do attraction spells or manifestation spells and I don't have the time to wait for a full moon, then I do it during the waxing phase. But I personally like to do it on full moons. Let's say you're doing your taxes, for example, and you want to get as much money back from your taxes as you can, then of course you could do that on a full moon. And then next up we have the waning moon, of course, which is, if you look at the moon phases in a circle, it would be exactly on the opposite side of the waxing moon. So while on the waxing moon we are wanting to make things grow and attract things, we would do exactly the opposite on a waning moon. So during the waning moon we would push things away. We want things to go away or to get smaller. So for example, if you have any blockages, you can make these blockages go away. You can banish things, you could banish energies, banish entities, you could do cleansings during the waning moon, you could cut ties with other people that you don't want in your life anymore. Basically anything where you want something to go away or get smaller, do that on a waning moon. And then lastly, when the moon is at its smallest, the next thing of course that happens is we don't see the moon anymore, so we only see the shadow side of the moon, that is the dark moon. And I personally really like to differentiate between the new moon and the dark moon, because when it's a new moon, we already see something. We already see a tiny little sickle, but if it's a dark moon, the only thing that we see of the moon, which seems like we're not seeing anything, is the shadow side of the moon. So personally, I feel like that is a great time to do anything that has to do with self-reflection, for example, shadow work, divination that has to do anything with self-reflection, a lot of journaling, but also any practices, any spells or rituals or workings that are a little bit more on the shadow side of things. So I know that some people would, for example, do hexing and cursing during dark moons. There are people who say you shouldn't do any workings on on dark moons. I don't really know if I agree with that. I have never actually used the dark moon specifically for working because I didn't need to really. But I can imagine like hexing and cursing and doing a little bit of those things, more of the shadowy side of things on a dark moon. What I personally really like to use it for is, as I said, divination, shadow work, self-reflection, basically anything where you have to face the shadow of things, because that is what you see of the moon. Now, as I already said, one moon cycle lasts for 29.5 days. So of course you have a full moon and new moon and dark moon every 29.5 days. But what happens if, for example, the full moon is at midnight and you don't have time that day to practice during midnight? That's not a problem. It's usually said that you can work with the moon phases on the day of this moon phase. So for example, if there is a full moon on 8 p.m, for example, then you can work that whole day with the full moon, but also the day before and the day after. So you have basically 3 days to work with the full moon, you have 3 days to work with the new or the dark moon, which of course, the new moon and the dark moon are right after another. So timing wise, that wouldn't make a difference. The intention makes the difference. But yeah, so don't stress. You don't have to do the working right during the full moon. You can do it one day before, during the day, and one day after. So we have 3 days for these specific moon phases. And then of course, the waxing and waning moon phases are very long. So we have a lot of time for doing the workings in these phases. And then lastly, this can get more specific than only looking at the moon phases. So for example, you could look at in which zodiac sign the moon is positioned during the full moon, for example. But that is a more difficult topic that I will get into in another video. I wanted to focus solely on the moon phases for this video. And that is also everything that I wanted to cover. If you have further questions, then definitely put them in the comments and I will make sure that I will try to answer all of your questions. And of course, also if you, for example, use specific moon phases for different things than I like to do, then also put them in the comments. Let's discuss it. Before I close this video though, as always, patron shout out. Thank you so much to Sigrun, Ashley, Erica, Sturfried Stars, Mars Mortis, Christine, Christopher, Glacier, Gael, August, The Court Jester, Tia, Fabienne, Tammy, Me, Jella, JB, Tim, Anna, Laura, Amber, Kristen, John, Ivy, Phoenix, Anton, Noemi, Jenny, Tyler, Els, Maggie, Betty, Misty, Tiffany, Amy, Colette, Tell, Timothy, Coffee, or the Honorary Gossip Squirrel, Bjorn, and Ash. Thank you so much for supporting me. As always, I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope, even if you're not a beginner anymore, you learned something maybe from this video. If you did, make sure to subscribe and give a thumbs up. And of course, check out my other socials because I'm annoying you everywhere. Check out my online shop for sustainably and ethically sourced witchcraft and paganism tools. And with that being said, I will see you in the next video. Bye!